So today we will be discussing tall larkspur and crested floating heart. Our first weed of the day is tall larkspur, or Delphinium exaltatum, a specific species of larkspur and tall larkspur. Larkspur may be divided into typically two subgroups, both tall and low. Tall larkspur itself is not a particular species, but it is a group of plants with similar appearances and habitats. Low larkspur is another group, and both tall and low larkspur are considered poisonous, just at varying degrees, depending on the species. Today we'll be discussing tall larkspur, particularly Delphinium exaltatum, one of the most poisonous, if not the most poisonous species of larkspur. Tall larkspur is native to eastern North America, particularly in Pennsylvania, Ohio, south throughout the Appalachians, northern Alabama, and in small isolated populations in south central Missouri in the Ozarks. Here in figure 1 is a map provided by the USDA showing the distribution of native tall larkspur locations here in the US. These locations are highlighted in green. Larkspur dates back to ancient times. It was even mentioned in the Bible, believe it or not. Its common name, obviously, is tall larkspur. Scientific name Delphinium exaltatum, and this weed is an herbaceous perennial. Aside from dating back to ancient times, it was documented in a little bit of detail in the 1500s, but it was documented in even more detail in 1845, and then further documented in Oregon in 1941. But this plant wasn't given a taxonomic classification until the 1990s. This plant can be found in the U.S. in states such as Alabama, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Missouri, and the Ozarks, which are found in Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Ideal weather conditions include full to partial sun, prairie remnants, dry, rich, open woods, thin, rocky soil, which you will find in the Ozarks in Missouri, ravines, fens, thickets, and they are most common on calcareous soils. Well, what are calcareous soils? According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, calcareous soils typically have 15% or more calcium carbonate, or as what a lot of us students like to call it, CaCO3. This may occur in many forms such as a powder, nodules, crusts, etc. Calcareous soils tend to be found in your drier areas in the world. They tend to be somewhat well aggregated soils, but they also have an impermeable hard pan that requires deep plowing to break the pan. They usually have low organic matter and nitrogen, and they are also lacking in phosphorus and micronutrients, particularly iron and zinc. Here in figure 2 is an image of tall larkspur at the Ozark Riverways on your thin, rocky soil. Figure 3 is an image of tall larkspur provided by North Carolina State University, which you will find in a thicket. The life cycle of tall larkspur includes blooming from July to September, flowers appearing in dense clusters along these tall stems. The flowers are usually a striking lavender blue, but can occasionally be found in red and white, with white being considered the rarest of all the colors. The structure of this flower is a 5-petal-like sepal, one of which will curve backwards, creating a spur, which is the reason this plant got its name. Figure 4 shows Delphinium exaltatum with its rarest color, the white florals. Figure 5 right next to it shows some red circles highlighting these spurs that you will find on the back of each individual flower. Further on the life cycle, after these flowers fade, your 3-section follicles or capsules will emerge, each of which containing numerous small seeds. It should be noted that these seeds, much like the rest of the plant in its entirety, are severely poisonous, containing toxic alkaloids, again, dangerous for both humans and animals. The plants will begin its growth cycle, again, every single year as a perennial. They will propagate primarily from seeds, but occasionally do propagate from rhizomes as well. Figure 6 shows the seed stages of tall larkspur. First you see the seeds, then we have the seed capsule, and then it's just more of a vegetative stage of the plant itself. And then figure 7 right next to it is a more zoomed in version of the seed follicles or capsules. Tall larkspur is a dicotyledon or a dicot with a taproot system. The stem is rounded and hollow. This is a broadleaf weed with alternate leaf arrangement, deeply lobed margins, They are palmately compounded leaves and are attached by a petiole to the stem. Figure 8 shows a taproot system that tall larkspur has, with the red highlighting the primary taproot, and branching from the primary taproot is a secondary taproot. Branching from that secondary taproot is then the tertiary root. Figure 9 is simply just a comparison of both a taproot and a fibrous root system. We would focus our attention to the left, showing another taproot system as opposed to its fibrous counterpart. Areas in the United States and the world affected include the western United States, including high plains, foothills, and mountain rangelands. Worldwide would be Canada, with a large cattle industry, believe it or not. The severity of this effect is quite high, resulting in high cattle loss throughout both the U.S. and Canada due to larkspur poisoning. Signs of these weeds include emergence, which you would see 2 cotyledons as a dicot, a reddish-green base that tapers up to a light green in the upper portions at an early growing stage. This is only in youth stages of the plant's growth cycle. And as this plant will mature, it will lose that reddish-green base and will simply just be a medium, possibly a darker green that tapers up to a light green at the top of the stem. The leaves at a young age are lanceolate to elliptical linear. As it matures, it will become a deeply lobed and palmately divided leaf into 5 different sections. The roots are fairly shallow for its overall height of 6 feet or 2 meters tall. And once again, it has taproots as a primary system. Figure 10 shows the top side of a more mature palmately compounded leaf, and figure 11 shows the underside of that same leaf. Economic importance for humans. The severity of the toxicity to humans will result in hospitalization and death. For animals, it results in high livestock losses, particularly cattle, and this results in monetary loss to producers in the U.S. or even Canada, yield loss in beef cattle, and less products for us consumers. Symptoms of poisoning that us humans might experience include burning of the lips and mouth upon contact. With ingestion, you will experience numbness and tingling of the throat, intense vomiting and diarrhea, muscle weakness and muscle spasms, a weak pulse, respiratory paralysis, convulsions, and then eventually fatality. For animals, it should be noted that the primary poison is an alkaloid, delphinine, which poses a paralyzing action on the lungs and the spinal cord. The symptoms of this poisoning is the same for all species of larkspur, just in varying degrees of effect. Delphinium exaltatum is one of the most toxic, if not the most toxic, of all the larkspur species, so the effect of this poison is extremely severe and is very easily noticed. Animals may fall down and struggle to get up. However, they may walk away over a period of time and show no further immediate symptoms of poisoning. However, they will stagger and fall shortly after, many times before becoming paralyzed, and then ultimately the lungs will collapse and death will follow. The animals will not lose their consciousness whenever they fall into paralysis, unlike other weeds that you may find in your pasture. Cattle will vomit to death, and this is typically due to suffocation from the vomited material itself getting in the windpipe as a result of paralysis of other systems within the body. It should be noted that all animals are always constipated, and this usually occurs in overgrazed pastures or fields. Animals will experience constipation, colic. This colic is a result of that constipation, increased salivation, stiffness, and weakness of the muscles, convulsions, respiratory paralysis, heart failure as a result of that respiratory paralysis, and ultimately death. There are some benefits to tall larkspur, some of which including its aesthetic appeal, which includes landscaping. Its height allows them to act as a natural barrier, and it also attracts beneficial insects such as your bees and butterflies, so your pollinators. You want these in your garden. They are, however, severely toxic to both humans and animals if ingested. Other benefits might include environmental benefits, such as a food source for your pollinators or other beneficial insects, soil stabilization, which includes reduced erosion and runoff, companion planting, which can aid in the growth of other plants. However, larkspur does indeed attract pests such as snails and slugs, aphids, leaf miners, stem borers, and spider mites. Here in Figure 12, we can see some of the pests attracted by tall larkspur. Some of the more common ones, the left would be a snail, and on the right, a slug. Figure 13 includes aphids. Aphids of all species are attracted by larkspur, and the same goes for in Figure 14 with a leaf miner. Leaf miners of all species are attracted by larkspur as well. Figure 14 shows a leaf miner, particularly in the larval stage, which is the stage in which they will feed on these leaves and leave these lines on those plants, like seen in the image. Figure 15 shows images of rice stem borers. Stem borers of all kinds are attracted by larkspur. The same goes for spider mites on the right in Figure 16. All species of spider mites are attracted by larkspur. Mechanical methods of control of tall larkspur include grubbing. This is the physical removal of the roots. For small, isolated areas, you can simply pull them out, considering they have quite shallow roots. However, you should use a shovel for somewhat larger but still small areas, and a tractor or excavator may be required for large areas of infestation. Chemical control is obviously said to be the most effective means of control of this plant. Silvex and 2,4,5-T are some of the more common methods of control. They are said to be the most effective. Silvex is applied 4 pounds per acre in a liquid form, so as a spray. You are to cover the entire plant and apply prior to budding or outflowering. 2,4,5-T is applied at 8 pounds per acre, but then the rest is essentially the same. This is a liquid form or a spray. You are to cover the entire plant and apply before budding or at flowering. Next, we will discuss crested floating heart. Crested floating heart is native to southeastern Asia, including countries such as India, Taiwan, Vietnam, and southern China. It was first discovered here in the United States in Florida in 1996. Obviously, its common name is crested floating heart, and its scientific name is Nymphoides cristata. This is once again, much like tall larkspur, an invasive perennial. It is native to southeastern Asia. It was grown as a water garden ornamental, and it was intentionally introduced to the U.S. in 1996. The species escaped cultivation in Florida and invaded a lake of a neighboring residential area, which spread to drainage canals throughout the state of Florida and then spread to various states throughout the U.S. U.S. locations include Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. Here in Figure 17, you can see locations of crested floating heart in the U.S. as of March 1st, 2025. This map was just uploaded by the USGS, or the United States Geological Survey, on March 1st. In the red, you can see these locations of crested floating heart, and most of which you can see are found near water bodies, which are shown in the blue on the map. Ideal weather conditions for crested floating heart include full or partial sun, a warm, temperate, or even a tropical climate, preferably in temperatures of 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It likes shallow standing water, typically 1 to 3 feet in depth, with a high organic matter content in soil, preferably sandy or silty soil, and an ideal pH range of 6.5 to 7.5. This plant can tolerate acidic pH ranges such as 3, 3.5, etc., and it will even tolerate water up to 9 feet deep. The ideal weather conditions for crested floating heart are still or slow-moving shallow bodies of water, such as your ponds, lakes, swamps, reservoirs, rivers, and canals. Figure 18 shows crested floating heart covering an entire water surface area in Florida. This image was taken August 5th of 2009. Figure 19 is a drone image of crested floating heart covering a very large area of a water body in Florida. At first glance, you might just think that's just algae in a swamp. Well, I did some digging. Turns out all of that is crested floating heart, and aside from the obvious trees and shrubs, that is crested floating heart covering that large area across that water body. The life cycle of this weed includes the production of small oblong seed capsules. Each capsule is less than 1 inch in length, each of which contain up to 20 seeds, and they also propagate through stem and leaf fragments. Then we have germination and establishment of colonies. The life cycle obviously has its vegetative and reproductive phase. It can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Sexual reproduction includes the pollination of their small white flowers on the water surface, which results in the formation of new seed capsules and seeds. The life cycle for asexual reproduction includes the stolons forming from the new plants, or even fragments breaking off and establishing new colonies. We then have maturity and dormancy in colder conditions, where the plant and seeds can remain viable through this dormant stage for the following year. Crested floating heart is a dicotyledon, or a dicot, containing a fibrous root system as opposed to a taproot system like we discussed before. Its stem is slender, round, and thin. This is also a broadleaf weed. However, instead of an alternate leaf arrangement, this one has a rosette leaf arrangement with entire or smooth margins and cordate or heart-shaped leaves. They are pinnately compounded and attached by a petiole. Figure 20 shows an image of a fibrous root system that we would find in this plant, and figure 21 is the same image as before, comparing the difference between taproot and fibrous root systems, except this time we would focus our attention to the right. Areas in the United States affected by the invasive crested floating heart species include Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. Areas in the world affected include parts of Asia, where it is non-native. The severity of this effect is once again very high, much like tall larkspur. However, rather than poisoning, we experience a rapid growth of this plant, forming dense, thick mats on the top of the surface of the water, which will shade out and outcompete native species. The decomposing vegetation will negatively impact the water quality and other aquatic life, and this excessive shading results in a decline in algae and will disrupt the entire aquatic food web. Signs of these weeds can be seen by their bright yellow star-like center and their little white flowers floating on the heart-shaped leaves on the surface of the water. These leaves are dark green in a young stage of growth with a deeper purple hue on the underside. As the plant matures, it will lose the dark green hue and become more of a light to medium green with a dark rim around it. And then the underside will have a pale purple, I think it looks more red to brown personally, but it'll have a more pale purple hue to it. At young stages in growth, it may have roots or nodes that appear to spread across the surface of the water before the plant itself has rooted. Figure 22 shows an image of crested floating heart flowers. You can very much see, particularly in the flower in the middle, the star-like center. I mean, I could pretty much draw a 5-point star right there. Figure 23 shows the leaves of a mature crested floating heart plant. As you can see, it's more of a light, maybe medium green in some spots with a dark rim around the edges. And then figure 24 shows that purple hue on the underside of the leaf. Signs of these weeds include tuberous propagules. There's small clusters that dangle from the nodes on the petiole, and this feature is helpful for the plant whenever it is not flowering. This growth habit may look like a small cluster of free-floating leaves on the water before they root, but once again, this is only the case in early growth stages. Economically, the control costs are very high, whether it be mechanical, biological, or chemical. They pose obstruction of waterways, which disrupts boating and fishing or other recreational activities, which can in turn reduce revenue for cities, towns, states, etc. Will impact fisheries by altering aquatic ecosystems and aquatic life and population distribution. It will damage infrastructure by clogging irrigation systems, which will increase maintenance and repair costs for these systems, and it can even reduce property value. Damage to humans, there is none per se outside of economic purposes. It is not toxic to us humans, so it's safe to touch, eat, whatever floats your boat. But it poses an indirect effect to both plants and animals. Crested floating heart will cause reduced oxygen levels within the water itself and then alter habitats and disrupting a natural balance within the aquatic ecosystem, and then shade out native plant species. This weed will also compete for sunlight, nutrients, and space. Sunlight in particular, these plants, since they form these dense mats on the surface of the water, they shade out the submerged native plants from the sunlight, reducing their ability to photosynthesize and thus reducing their ability to grow. They displace native aquatic plants, which results in a reduced biodiversity, risking either endangerment or even extinction of rare species. And then as far as environmental chemistry goes, an altered nutrient balance within the water and ecosystem itself can result in eutrophication, which will further result in declined water quality and negative impacts on aquatic plants and other species. There are some aesthetic beneficial concepts for crested floating heart, but they're only aesthetic. This includes for water gardens. The invasiveness by far outweighs the aesthetic appeal of this plant. Cons include it's extremely invasive. They densely cover the entire surface of water bodies. They outcompete your native plants and animal species. They impact water quality and other marine life, and they disrupt entire aquatic food webs. Mechanical control includes water drawdown, which is simply just reducing the level of water to reduce the viability of these plants, because exposure to air over a period of time will eventually kill these weeds. Another mechanical method is mechanical harvesting, which is simply pulling the plant from the roots out of the ground in the water. However, this is deemed ineffective because any form of a fragment that may be left behind by the root to stem, leaf, etc. will eventually propagate and form new colonies of crested floating heart in that same water body, and the effort performed would have been futile. Biological control. There are no known effective measures, but there have been a few that have been studied, including insect herbivores such as a leaf beetle, your pathogens such as fungi and bacteria, and even fish such as the grass carp. Again, these are not deemed effective. The only method deemed effective is chemical control, and even so, this is extremely expensive and it still takes time. Chemical control includes methods such as 2,4-D and indethol. They are both to be applied in spring, except 2,4-D is applied at new growth. Indethol is applied during active growth. 2,4-D is applied at 2 parts per million concentration. Indethol is 2 to 5 parts per million. Both are to ensure thorough coverage of the plant and to be repeated 3 to 5 weeks after the initial application. Then we have triclopyr and glyphosate. Both are applied in early spring during that active growth. They both have the same concentration of 2 to 5 parts per million. You are to ensure thorough coverage and again repeat 3 to 5 weeks after the initial application if needed. Then we have imazamox, which is to be applied in early spring during active growth. What do you know? It is 16 to 64 ounces per acre. This is a foliar spray that is to ensure thorough coverage of the plant and repeat 3 to 5 weeks after that initial application once again. Fluridone, 5 to 15 parts per billion, is a liquid or granular form, has a slow mode of action, and is to be repeated as needed. Pinoxylim, once again, has a slow mode of action and is to be repeated as needed, but this one has a concentration of 30 to 90 parts per billion. Fluopyroxafen benzoyl is applied in early spring during active growth at a concentration of 10 to 40 parts per billion. This is a liquid treatment that is applied to a whole lake or a large area treatment, and it has a static exposure time of 6 to 48 hours, but it is deemed quite effective in controlling crested floating heart. These are my references. Thank you. Do you have any questions?